Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I'm recording almost in the dark. I'm recording from my girlfriend's sister's house, and there are a lot of rooms in this house where she basically has hardly any light, unfortunately. But yeah, I'm going to be uh, mostly talking about a video clip and other things that I won't need to show you me for, so I guess it doesn't matter. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was that a few days ago, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was confronted by a couple of her constituents regarding her votes in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine and backing the U.S. proxy war with Russia. And she and the rest of the squad and so-called progressives among the Democrats in Congress, and actually all of the Democrats, have voted for these weapons packages, multi-billion-dollar weapons packages being sent to Ukraine every single time. The only people, and there haven't been very many of them, but the only Congress people who've voted against this military aid to Ukraine have been Republicans. And one of many responses that defended AOC and attacked the protesters was from YouTuber Kyle Kulinski, who is a co-founder of the Justice Democrats, which is one of the groups that tried unsuccessfully to reform the Democratic Party, make it more progressive. So they backed AOC in her 2018 run for Congress, her first run for Congress. And so Kyle made a video recently where he defended AOC's vote for military aid to Ukraine and engaged in various ad hominem attacks on the people who protested at her town hall the other day. So it seems clear to me that he's having trouble letting go of the fact that his effort to reform the Democratic Party has been a failure. And he says he criticizes AOC, but basically hardly at all on foreign policy from what I've observed. And he's extremely ill-informed about the situation in Ukraine, to say the least. So we'll get into that. But let me just go to the video here, and I'm going to play a few excerpts from it here and there, and then comment, and also fill in all the background that about Ukraine that Kulinski, like AOC, is completely oblivious to, or purports to be anyway. So, right off the bat here with the title, AOC confronted by quote-unquote anti-war Tulsi fans. Kyle's making pretty clear what his agenda is. He's announcing right up front that the focus is going to be on attacking the protesters rather than on discussing what it is that AOC is being confronted about, namely her support for the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. Now, he does discuss the Ukraine issue, but as we'll see, it was a very superficial discussion. And it takes him all of 20 seconds to claim that the protesters aren't real, quote-unquote, anti-war protesters. So let me just play that for you here.
Alright guys, so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was doing an event, a Q&A event, and it looks like it's probably from her district in New York, although I'm not 100% sure, but this video is going viral on Twitter because she got confronted by anti-war protesters. Now, they don't put anti-war in air quotes. I'm going to put anti-war in air quotes.
So, finally, right here, he starts the video of the speech.
Which you voted to send arms and weapons to Ukraine. Tulsi gathers, she's left the Democratic Party because they're one for us, okay?
So, Okay, a couple of seconds. I should have let it run till he paused it and started talking, but he basically let it run for 15 seconds and then paused it to object that there were other reasons besides the Democrats being warmongers that Tulsi Gabbard left the Democrats. As if this were relevant to why the protesters were protesting OC. Like they're going to talk about why else she might have left the Democratic Party besides the reason that they were there to protest. They mentioned Tulsi leaving the Democrats partly because of, because they wanted to contrast her stance opposing the Ukraine proxy war to AOC's and all the other Democrats. So why would they bring up other reasons Tulsi left? Tulsi's not the subject of their protests. They just brought her up to say, look, even Tulsi Gabbard is against the war in Ukraine. Why are you in favor of backing Ukraine in this war? Okay, let's hear what Kyle has to say here.
You originally voted, you ran as...
Let me pause it already, because this guy saying Tulsi Gabbard left the Democratic Party because they are war hawks. That is not the only reason she left the Democratic Party. That was one of 5, 6, 7 different reasons why she left. And most of the reasons why she left were actually right-wing criticisms of law.
Okay.
That's why she joined some other left-wing third party, and that's why she's doing it, because she's so principled and she's still criticizing Democrats from their left. That's not true. That's not true. Tulsi has, for about a year now, most of the criticism she has of the Democrats are actually from their right, not from...
Okay. Yeah, maybe. I mean, we can talk about that some other time. Tulsi Gabbard is certainly a mixed bag politically, to say the least, but that's not the point, Kyle. She has always been critical of this war and various other wars that the U.S. has backed, such as the war in Yemen and the war in Syria and so on and so forth, or that it's been involved in for the entire time she's been involved in national politics. And that's what the issue is here. That's what this protest is about. Now, yes, indeed, she is campaigning for a Trump-aligned New Hampshire Senate candidate, that's, as it says there. However, as the New York Times discusses, there's even if you don't agree with her doing this, which I'm not sure. I think this is the best idea. But there's a method to her madness. It's not just random. There are various combat veterans, such as this fellow General Don Baldock, retired general that she's campaigning for, who oppose the war effort in Ukraine, and so that's why she's supporting this particular fellow who is, running in New Hampshire, which was kind of Gabbard's home base during the 2020 election campaign when she ran for president. So let's see what the Times says about Mr. Baldock. So Baldock says, I worked for Milley, I worked for Austin, I worked for Mattis, said Don Baldock, I guess, I'm not sure how you say it, retired brigadier general challenging Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat from New Hampshire. He said, their concerns centered around the military-industrial complex and maintaining the military-industrial complex so as 3- and 4-star generals, they can roll right into very lucrative jobs. As you may be aware, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, current Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, came to this job straight from being the, I think he was the CEO of Raytheon, one of the top 5 defense contractors, if not the largest military contractor, and before that he was um, a general. Um, and let's see what else Mr. Baldock had to say. There was one other quote from him in here. For Mr. Baldock, the Senate nominee in New Hampshire, the ideological shift has been more dramatic. He was one of the first Americans to make contact with Hamid Karzai, who was installed as Afghanistan's president shortly after the U.S. invasion, and was an outspoken defender of him. In 2018, just after General Baldock's retirement, he decried the Trump White House in the Daily Beast for, quote, exacerbating divisiveness by not demonstrating patience and restraint, not listening to experts, attacking people with their opinions, ruining reputations, threatening institutions, abusing the media, and leading people to question our position as a beacon for promoting democracy throughout the world. Okay, yeah, right. But now he tells voters the United States needs to avoid Iran, has done enough in Ukraine, and should undertake a wholesale reevaluation of its posture in the world. Mr. Baldock contends that the interventionist views of former Senator John McCain and successors like Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina arose from a belief in what he called the military easy button. My generation of combat veterans thinks the exact opposite, he said. Okay, so, kind of wishy-washy, qualified opposition to U.S. intervention abroad. But in any case, that's why Gabbard is supporting him. It's not just because he's right-wing, as Kyle would have us believe. So, it takes Kyle 4 minutes of this video, during which the vast majority of what he says is about Tulsi Gabbard, before he finally goes back to the protest action. Let's see if I can find where he does that. Okay, still more about Gabbard. More about Gabbard. 4 minutes in.
Really cool stuff. Alright, let's run this back a little bit.
Nuclear war, which you voted to send arms and weapons to Ukraine. Tulsi Gabbard, she's left the Democratic Party because there are some who are us, okay? You originally voted, you ran as an outsider, yet you've been voting to start this war in Ukraine.
What?
You're voting to start a third nuclear war with Russia and China.
That is massively overstated. Who invaded who? Who invaded who? Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S. didn't invade Ukraine. The U.S. didn't invade Russia. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. So.
Okay, so so this is basically a simplistic perspective on what's happening that he repeats throughout this video, and I will talk in a few minutes about what is wrong with his perspective. But let's keep going for a little bit here. He says some other strange and ill-informed things.
So in the wake of Russia invading Ukraine, why is it a bad thing to give them defensive weapons? Now, look, I've told you guys this. After the first, 2 or 3 packages, I would have started to wrap it up a little bit. At this point, we've had, over a dozen packages sent to Ukraine?
Okay, well, that begs the question, on what basis are you saying to, quote-unquote, wrap it up? You're justifying giving this military aid to Ukraine, supposedly for them to defend themselves, and now you're saying, okay, we should cut off these alleged weapons for self-defense. He never explains his rationale. Anyway, let's play this back just a little more.
And it's been somewhere between $50 billion and $80 billion sent to Ukraine, yeah, I agree that's overkill. And yeah, I agree that's probably because, you know, the politicians are enriching the military-industrial complex. That's probably the thing that they care about first and foremost. So I don't deny that it's overkill, but to say that this means you want a nuclear war, what kind of bullshit is that? If the United States sent weapons to Palestinians to defend themselves against Israeli aggression, would this guy say, "Oh, you're a war hawk, you're pro-war"? My guess is no. My guess is he would understand. Well, those are defensive weapons to the Palestinians, so that's very different by its nature, because it is.
Okay. I mean, this is a ridiculous comparison. You know, it shows he knows nothing whatsoever about Ukraine, for one thing. Because on one hand, Israel is an apartheid state. It's even called that now by U.S.-based human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Israel has subjugated Palestinians for 74 years, its entire existence. You made them second-class citizens in their own land or kicked them out of their land. You violated their rights in all sorts of ways. But as for what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, basically, Kyle is completely oblivious to anything that's happened in Ukraine prior to February 24th of this year, when Russia's military operation in Ukraine began. The way he presents it, Russia suddenly decided to invade Ukraine on February 24th. But, I mean, let's take a glance at what's actually been happening in Ukraine over the past few years and how the U.S. has been involved in that. Because we need to understand that if we're going to understand what's been going on in Ukraine. Okay, I need to call up my highlighting here. This is an article on Ukraine that I wrote a few months ago that looks at things in detail. Okay, let me see if it's showing my highlights here. Hopefully. Okay, so let's go back to 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. At that time, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union. It actually had largely been part of Russia within the Soviet Union prior to 1954. But anyway, so it becomes an independent state in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolves. And as you might expect if you know about how the U.S. government's foreign policy works, not surprisingly, once Ukraine became independent, the U.S. attempted to interfere in Ukraine's political affairs, and also in Russia's. Throughout the 1990s, the U.S. actually rigged the 1996 Russian election so that Boris Yeltsin would win re-election because he was basically a U.S. puppet. As for Ukraine, a propaganda campaign was launched by the U.S. after the 2004 election, implying that the winning candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, had cheated and accusing him of being quote-unquote pro-Russian. Basically, what pro-Russian means in U.S. parlance is neutral between Russia and the U.S., and rather than being a puppet of the U.S. So the U.S. backed with $14 million in quote-unquote humanitarian aid through the National Endowment for Democracy, a color revolution that basically made them do the election over again in Ukraine. And so the U.S.'s favored candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was declared president. And as you might expect, given, if you understand how the U.S. attempts to run the world, Yushchenko implemented a program of austerity, of neoliberalism, trashed Ukraine's economy. He also attempted to suppress the language rights of the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. So basically the situation in Ukraine is that in the eastern part of the country, the majority of people speak Russian and are ethnically Russian. And there's a considerable Russian population in the rest of the country, although they're not as numerous there. So these policies made him pretty unpopular. He lost quite badly to Yanukovych in the 2010 election, only receiving 5% of the vote. So, Yanukovych, this so-called pro-Russian politician, is back in power. He's not, obviously, he's not a perfect president. He's kind of corrupt, but he wasn't a U.S. puppet like Yushchenko had been. And the U.S. didn't like that too much. In 2013, Yanukovych rejected a partnership agreement with the EU because it would have required Ukraine to accept an IMF loan that would have required further privatization of the Ukrainian economy, deep cuts in government social programs. The whole deal that the IMF tries to shove down the throats of countries that accept its loans. And so instead, Yanukovych accepted a much more favorable offer of economic aid from Russia. And the U.S. just freaked out, as did more Western-oriented or right-wing elements of the Ukrainian public. So there were big street protests led by far-right elements in Ukraine, such as Svoboda, which is a Nazi party, C14, Right Sector, other fascist groups. And these groups, shockingly, were heavily backed by the U.S.'s National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, and the U.S. government generally. And various politicians, including Senators John McCain, Amy Klobuchar, and Chris Murphy, as well as Vice President Joe Biden, met with these fascist forces and expressed their approval for this uprising, which came to be called the Maidan Revolution. And finally, in February 2014, they threatened violence against Yanukovych and his cabinet, and he was forced to resign and had to flee the country for his life, as did cabinet members. Okay, so the U.S. has backed these open fascists, basically, but they figured they couldn't get away with just appointing a fascist to lead Ukraine. So they picked this guy from a right-wing but not overtly fascist political party as the new Ukrainian prime minister. And members of this fascist organization, Svoboda, as well as various foreign citizens, including Americans, were appointed somehow to the cabinet of Ukraine's new coup government. So they further gut social programs and implement neoliberal economic policies, making Ukraine within short order the poorest country in Europe. And in addition, among the first actions of the coup government were to ban the Ukrainian Communist Party and other left-wing parties, reinstitute the attacks on the language rights of the Russian minority that Yanukovych's predecessor had enacted. So, for example, they wouldn't allow schools to conduct classes in Russian. And a lot of Ukrainians were very unhappy with the coup government, particularly in the eastern part of the country. So protests against the coup broke out in cities around the country, particularly in the Donbass region in the east, and the southeastern region, Crimea, which had been part of Russia for most of its history, actually. And polls in this part of the country indicated that the overwhelming majority of the population was opposed to this new government. So these protests were then violently attacked by the fascists. And particularly violent attack occurred in the city of Odessa in the southern part of the country, where basically they locked hundreds of protesters in a labor union building and set the building on fire, resulting in 48 of them being burned alive. And similarly, there was violence in various other cities in the east and south of Ukraine, such as Mariupol and Melitopol. And basically, those places wound up being under de facto fascist control. However, in Crimea, in the southeast peninsula, in the southeast corner of the country, and in much of the Donbass region, the protests were a lot more successful, and basically, the people there had had enough of the coup government and its anti-Russian bigotry. So, both these areas held referendums to declare autonomy from Ukraine. So 87% of people in the Donbass region, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, or provinces, people voted to form independent governments, separate from Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Whereas in Ukraine, there was a referendum to actually join Russia or rejoin Russia. And 96% of people in Crimea supported that, and so Crimea once again became part of the Russian Federation, as it had been, prior to 1954, and then between 1954 and 91, it was part of the Soviet Union. There happens to be a Russian military base in Sevastopol, Crimea. So, Ukraine decided it wouldn't be a good idea to try to attack what was by then, part of Russia with a Russian military base there. However, they retaliated against Crimea by damming the canal that had supplied the majority of its water, which really screwed up their economy, particularly their agricultural sector. However, Crimea benefited in a lot of ways from joining Russia. No more discrimination against the Russian language, obviously. And Crimea began to overcome its economic problems and develop economically. However, in the Donbass region, where they didn't actually try to vote to join Russia, and Russia didn't want them at that time to hold a referendum to join Russia, they weren't so lucky. Immediately after their independence votes, the coup government sent troops there in an attempt to forcibly retake control of the region from what they called terrorists. People who basically wanted to live their lives peacefully somehow are terrorists. Particularly the fascist paramilitary groups, the Azov Battalion and several others, attacked the Donbass region, and eventually the rest of the Ukrainian military, which had initially been reluctant, joined in. And the upshot has been, an 8-year civil war involving relentless attacks of civilian areas, like literally the center of cities with no military installations anywhere nearby, in the Donbass region. And over 14,000 people died between February 2014 and February 2022 in this region. Some of them Ukrainian soldiers, some of them members of the Donetsk and Luhansk militia groups that were trying to defend the Donbass, and quite a few civilians. And throughout that time, the U.S. and other NATO countries, and even Israel, had been supplying Ukraine with military aid and training, despite, or maybe because of, being well aware of this civil war and all the violence that was going on, and of the strong influence of literal Nazis and other far-right forces within the Ukrainian military and security services and government. So, this didn't go on uninterrupted. There have been efforts to try and resolve the situation. So, in September 2014, a few months after all this started, an agreement was reached in Minsk, which I forget what country that's in, one of the Eastern European countries. Anyway, between Russia and Ukraine, and representative of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as well as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So this agreement called for a ceasefire and called for limited autonomy for the Donbass region. And within a few days, Ukraine just started shelling the Donbass region again. DPR forces obviously had tried to defend themselves from these attacks on Donetsk, which is the largest city in the Donetsk People's Republic. So, eventually they go back to the negotiating table. The Minsk II agreement was signed in February 2015. That was violated almost immediately, even though there was a unanimous UN Security Council vote supporting it. So, even the United States supposedly supported it at that time. And leaders of the fascist militia groups said, we're not honoring this agreement. And then the Ukrainian government as a whole said it wouldn't honor the agreement unless the Donbass rebels surrendered, leaving themselves defenseless to Ukraine violating the agreement. So obviously they refused. So basically, this pattern of fascist-led violence against particularly Russian-speaking citizens continued, and it wasn't only in those cities like Mariupol and Melitopol that where fascists dominated, but there were terror attacks in other cities such as Kharkov and Kiev against communists, against people of Russian ethnicity, against gay and lesbian and bi and trans people, Roma people, etc. And the West portrays Ukraine as a democracy, but since the coup, it's been a very repressive society where anybody who was in any way sympathetic to communism or socialism or Russia is persecuted. Any communist or Soviet associated symbols or propaganda, and even singing the Internationale, famous workers' rights communist song, all of these things are banned and punishable by prison terms. As are celebrations of Victory Day, which is the day that's celebrated every year in Russia and was before that in the Soviet Union. Celebration of the anniversary of the Soviet Union's victory over the Nazis. Basically anything, whether it be textbook references or statues of Vladimir Lenin or anything reminding people of the Soviet Union or of the history of World War II, where the Soviets defeated the Nazis. All that was erased. And kidnapping and torture and executions of anybody on the left have become commonplace. And conversely, fascists who participated in the Holocaust and continued their violent activities after World War II have been honored. So, for example, Stepan Bandera, the best known leader of the Ukrainian Nazis during World War II, is now celebrated as a hero in Ukraine. His birthday is a national holiday. And so, yeah, well, as I said, lots and lots of persecution against Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, LGBT folks, women, desecration of Holocaust monuments, racist diatribes about Jews. All of this has become commonplace in Ukraine. Yeah, and you know, this fact about Ukraine, that there's considerable far right and fascist influence on Ukrainian politics, especially since 2014, has often been denied or downplayed by Western media. Although, prior to February 2022, there was a fair bit of acknowledgement of that in Western media. Certainly more than Kyle Kulinski acknowledges it. And in 2019, Vladimir Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, was elected, in a landslide because the president who was elected in 2014, Poroshenko, was just an outright sympathizer with the fascists and was responsible for all the discriminatory laws and repressive policies that I just talked about. But even though Zelensky was Jewish and in fact ethnically Russian, he really didn't change anything. And if you see who backed him in his campaign, and if you understand how much influence these heavily armed Nazis have in Ukraine, you can kind of understand what happened. So this corrupt billionaire, Igor Kolomoisky, was the owner of a TV network where Vladimir Zelensky, who was a comedian and actor before he became president, had his TV show, Servant of the People. And he literally played the role of president of Ukraine in that TV show. So anyway, Kolomoisky backs the TV show because he's part owner of this network. He also, as it turns out, has a controlling interest in Burisma, the gas company that paid Joe Biden's son $80,000 a month for sitting on its board at one point. And also, Kolomoisky then went on to be the leading funder of Zelensky's election campaign, and he was a co-founder of the Azov Battalion and has been a leading private funder of Azov and other Ukrainian fascist groups. So Zelensky did a lot of the same stuff as his predecessor. And his ties to the far right became more and more overt. So this April, Zelensky met via video link with the Greek parliament to beg Greece to send Ukraine weapons. And appearing on the video with him was a member of the Azov Battalion, this fascist group, this literal neo-Nazi group in Ukraine. So all this Western propaganda that Kyle buys into about how Nazism or fascism can't be a serious problem in Ukraine because its president is Jewish, and the fascists don't have they haven't fared very well in elections in recent years. The fact of the matter is that just like some Jews during World War II, and by the way, just like Israel, which is a leading funder of Ukraine's military, Zelensky's a Nazi collaborator. That's the bottom line. Zelensky's a Nazi collaborator, and particularly in eastern Ukraine, people regard this is a Nazi government. The Maidan coup, they say, is a Nazi takeover of Ukraine, or was a Nazi takeover of Ukraine, and they don't really think that Zelensky becoming president has really changed much of anything. Okay, so people who try to minimize the problem of far-right violence in Ukraine and the repressive nature of Ukrainian society generally say quite often, as Kyle does, but Russia has Russia's repressive and it has fascist elements too. But although that's true, that's a bit of a false equivalency. There's certainly political repression in Russia, as there is in most every country, including the United States. But there's a difference between a country like Ukraine that bans all left-wing opposition and now all opposition media. Basically, Ukraine has just one media outlet now, the government media outlet. And in Russia, there's pretty much a free press. The Communist Party is the second leading party in the Duma, as opposed to in Ukraine, the Communist Party and all other left-wing parties are banned, and their leaders have mostly been jailed. And certainly right-wing extremists exist in Russia, as they do in almost every other society. But again, there's a difference between a society such as Russia, where actually open Nazism and Holocaust denial are illegal and are often punished. People are sent to jail for expressing these sorts of sentiments. And every year, Russia celebrates, as the biggest national holiday of the year, their victory over the Nazis during World War II. And in contrast, in Ukraine, openly neo-Nazi groups are fully incorporated in the military, and they celebrate, at least since 2014, they have celebrated the fascist elements in Ukraine's past, such as Stepan Bandera and others who collaborated with the Nazis in the Holocaust. Okay, so Russia kept trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. Again, it took 8 years before they finally, invaded Ukraine. So, and meanwhile, Zelensky refused to meet with representatives of the Donbass republics to try and, get agreement on the Minsk Accords. The representatives from the Donbass wanted Zelensky, who'd promised he would, at first promised he would abide by the Minsk Accords, to get, they're trying to get Ukraine's government to agree to it. And Zelensky refused to meet with them, saying, "I'm not holding talks with terrorists." Which is, of course, very reminiscent of what George Bush and others in our own country have often said. And meanwhile, Zelensky declared that his military was going to try to invade Crimea and recover it, quote unquote, from Russia. So, in other words, Zelensky announced plans to invade Russia. And one thing that you have to recognize about the U.S. attitude toward all this is, look, the U.S. all along has had the objective to weaken Russia, to undermine the Russian government. Hopefully, from their point of view, they hoped to see it overthrown. There's actually a RAND Corporation document that explicitly calls for weakening and trying to overthrow Russia. And one of the approaches that they advocate using to bring that about is to try and destabilize Ukraine and use it as an element to indirectly attack Russia. But Russia was still trying to seek peace last year. So in December of last year, Russia submitted draft treaties to the U.S. and to NATO, calling for security guarantees for itself and NATO countries that included an end to further expansion of NATO, which by that point had expanded, by a couple dozen countries from what its membership was, prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And by the way, I guess I should say NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was originally a supposedly defensive alliance to defend Western Europe from the alleged designs of the Soviet Union on Western Europe. And then, in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the ostensible purpose of NATO had vanished, and yet instead of dissolving, NATO expanded. And Russia has been saying for decades, look, this is a problem. You're stationing weapons closer and closer to our country, carrying out military exercises along our borders, etc. And so, we propose to put an end to this. No more expansion of NATO, no more military exercises on each other's borders, no offensive weapons deployed on Russia's borders or Russian deployment of such weapons on other countries' borders, arms control, etc. And basically, this attempt to seek peace was just kind of ignored. And to make a long story short, although there had been a bit of a lull at times in the shelling of the Donbass region, it really picked up in mid-February of this year. And following the usual pattern, there were lots of indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas, and suddenly there were more than 100,000 Ukrainian troops gathered on the borders of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And allegedly, a plan was discovered by the Russian security service of a plan to launch a full-scale invasion and assault on those areas sometime in March. So as a result of all that, the governments in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics requested that Russia finally recognize their independence from Ukraine, which Russia had refused to do up until that point, and ratify a mutual assistance treaty, which, basically what that means is that if regions declare independence and say, they're independent countries, even if they're not recognized by the United Nations, a legal case has been made that they can request assistance from from UN members countries when they are under attack, or there's a threat to attack them, or in this case there actually was a lot of shelling going on. So basically, that's how this operation of the Russian military in Ukraine began. The Russian government, recognized these republics as independent, and then initiated what they called their special military operation, where he sent about 100,000 troops in with the stated purpose of protecting the people of the Donbass region from the attacks by the Ukrainian military, and in conjunction with that goal, demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. So that's in a nutshell what the situation is. But all Kyle can say is, who invaded who? Who invaded who? Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. U.S. didn't invade Ukraine or Russia. Blah blah blah. So, a little later on, Kulinski acknowledged that NATO had expanded greatly after 1991, but claims that this just gave Russia an excuse to invade. He doesn't acknowledge that not only Russian officials, but U.S. officials said, hey, that's pretty dangerous, that's pretty provocative to keep on expanding NATO eastward, particularly given that the U.S. promised Russia that it wouldn't be expanded, back in 1991. And Kyle claims that supposedly Putin had implied in a recent speech that he planned to invade Ukraine anyway. Which, I mean, there was 8 years where Russia didn't do anything. They didn't even recognize the self-proclaimed independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. They didn't send troops in for all that time, and they kept negotiating peace treaties. So, what the hell was that all about? And what the hell were all these warnings from Russia over a period of decades? That expansion of NATO was crossing a red line for them. And it seems like Kyle is utterly oblivious to how the U.S. ruling class operates in terms of foreign policy. They literally have had dismembering Russia as a stated goal for a long time. Which they've done that to other countries. They destroyed Yugoslavia in the late 1990s. They destroyed Libya in I believe 2011. They interfered in the 1996 Russian election to make sure their puppet Boris Yeltsin got reelected. They've backed coups in Haiti and Bolivia, and attempted coups in Venezuela. A soft coup in Brazil that brought Bolsonaro to power ultimately, and on and on. I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list, but everywhere the U.S. tries to dominate different regions of the world and tries to overthrow any government that tries to pursue its own path and develop economically in its own interests. That's what Russia's tried to do after they got rid of Yeltsin, who was basically a U.S. puppet who sold off Russian assets to foreign corporations and to various wealthy people in Russia. Sold off state assets. Say what you want about Putin. He's certainly got his political issues. He's definitely no socialist. He's conservative on a lot of social issues. But he's an economic nationalist. He's nationalized many of Russia's natural resources, their banking sector, and so on and so forth. And the U.S. doesn't like that. That's a lot of what's going on here. So I don't know if I even want to show you any more of Kulinski's video. I'll put a link in here so you can watch it if you want. But I don't know. He spends like half of this 18-minute video criticizing Tulsi Gabbard. Okay, I'll look at a little more of it here. Okay. Let's look at about 10 and a half minutes in. Okay, I'm going to actually show you a little more of... okay, so Kyle's still going on about Tulsi Gabbard. 10 minutes in. Okay, let's show a little more of the protests by these guys against AOC. Which, by the way, they really held her feet to the fire.
As pro-war, they are more pro-war.
You showed how it is. I believed in you, and you became the very thing you sought to fight against. That's what you've become. You are the establishment, and you are the reason why everybody will end up in a nuclear war unless you choose to stand.
So AOC is the reason why everybody's going to be in a nuclear war. Not, I don't know, the person who would drop the nuke? Vladimir Putin?
Okay, so what a straw man. I mean, they're protesting AOC because of her hypocrisy. She's a person who came into office, who campaigned for office, saying that people, if they want to change, they needed to do exactly what these guys are doing. They needed to protest and be disruptive, and they needed to stand for their principles and not take no for an answer. And she's claimed when she was running for Congress that if I have to only be a one-term Congresswoman because I get attacked so much, I'm gonna stand for my principles and push for change, come what may. And that isn't what she did at all. And now she's supporting this war on Ukraine after running as a peace candidate in 2018. So they're saying, look, she's sold out. That's what they're saying here. And not only that she's sold out, but she's one of this unanimous group of Democratic legislators that's backing war in Ukraine. And so the Democratic Party as a whole is worthless in terms of opposing U.S. involvement in wars. And so Kulinski goes on to claim, well, Putin's the one who would drop nuclear weapons, and basically implies that Jose Vega, the second protester here, should have protested Putin instead, and claims that he's missing the plot because supposedly the U.S. and Ukraine didn't start the war; Russia started the war. Of course, he's ignoring. This war's been going on for over 8 years.
He's not the reason. The guy who would do it if it's going to be done. He's not the problem. I understand reserving some criticism for the West, saying you have to insist on some sort of diplomatic end to this. I get that. So you want to put some of the blame at the people who are escalating out of control. I agree with you, right? But you're totally missing the plot if you're discussing this as if the U.S. is steering the ship, the U.S. is to blame, or Ukraine is to blame. Because Ukraine didn't start the war, the U.S. didn't start the war, Russia started the war.
Okay, blah, blah, blah. Totally ignores. The war's been going on for over 8 years. Treats Ukraine as some sort of innocent victim that hasn't been, persecuting its own citizens for 8 plus years. He says that they're missing the plot by not blaming Putin and not recognizing that Putin is the one who would drop nuclear bombs. Despite the fact that Russia's stated policy, which Putin has affirmed, is they would not be the first to use nuclear weapons, unless there was an actual threat to basically overthrow the Russian government. But otherwise, they're not going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They don't need to. They're winning. They obviously, despite Western aid, which is drying up, have an enormous military advantage over Ukraine. They have the most technologically advanced conventional weaponry in the world, even more so, believe it or not, than the U.S., despite spending a small fraction of the U.S.'s military budget, a lot of which is wasted on gold-plated weapon systems that cost a lot more than they're worth, and on these 800 military bases that the U.S. Has around the world. Russia gets a lot more bang for the buck in terms of their military budget. But anyway, especially after several 100,000 more Russian troops come into Ukraine, the outcome of the war is a foregone conclusion. Russia has no need for desperation. So, hopefully there won't be a nuclear war, and hopefully cooler heads will prevail. But anyway, let's see what else of this protest Kyle plays.
Stop right now and denounce the Democratic Party. Will you do that?
Okay, well, so let me ask.
Okay, so, he let about a sentence and a half go by before he interrupted again. Oh, wait, I should... Actually, just before this, he played 3 words of what the protester was saying and then interrupted to go back to talking about Tulsi. And then he goes on later on to criticize Tulsi Gabbard some more and criticize Jose Vega for backing Tulsi Gabbard or her opposition to the war, or bringing her up as an example. Basically, is what all that he did. An example of opposition to the war. So basically, the rest of this video I'm not going to play anymore. Pretty much the same worthless drivel where he has no idea what's really going on, and it's all about attacking the protesters and defending AOC. Now, you can certainly talk about the politics of the protesters or Tulsi Gabbard, who the protesters mentioned, because she's the only Democrat or former Democrat at this point in time of national prominence who's been against the Ukraine war. You can look at her Twitter feed and you will see she's been very consistently opposed to this whole thing, including before Russia intervened. And same with other realms of foreign policy. Ever since 2013, when she came into office in Congress, she's opposed U.S. intervention in Syria, for example. And on the other hand, she has some political views that most of us on the left would strongly reject. She, for instance, is very concerned about immigrants coming in such large numbers, and I won't go into details more than that, but just a number of issues with her politics, and yet again, the only reason that they brought her up was to point out that in contrast to all these Democrats who are warmongers, Tulsi Gabbard has consistently opposed this war in Ukraine. As for the protesters themselves, they're part of a group, the Schiller Institute, that has connections with the Lyndon LaRouche organization that, has some political views, again, that most of us on the left would reject. So, for example, they minimize the problem of climate change. But, again, these are the people who protested a politician, confronted AOC, and she's not the only politician they've confronted. They recently protested Jamal Bowman for his support for the war, because he too claimed to be progressive when he ran for office, but actually turns out he's a warmonger. And the video of this protest has been viewed millions of times. I think it's over 10 million views now. So this is the most significant action against the U.S. proxy war in Russia, with Russia, that there's been. Because there's hardly been any protests against this war. The anti-war movement is dead at this point in time. So why not focus on, the fact that there's this significant protests, where these people, regardless of what else you might think about their politics, are staunchly opposed to U.S. Military intervention in Ukraine or most anywhere else. I've looked at Jose's Twitter feed. He's a staunch anti-interventionist. And the fact that they've been so criticized for problematic aspects of their politics, rather than recognized for having the balls to call AOC out publicly for being an imperialist shitball, this begs the question: where is the left on this war? Why is Tulsi Gabbard virtually the only prominent political figure? And I'm not saying she's on the left, but she's the only prominent political figure who's speaking out unequivocally against the Ukraine war. Why didn't somebody from, say, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, which has big membership in the New York City area, why didn't they protest AOC? Where were they? And why are virtually none of these armchair critics who claim without evidence that Tulsi's opposition to this war, or the Schiller Institute guys' opposition to this war, is insincere, just because there are other aspects of their politics that you don't agree with? That doesn't mean that, you don't have to be a leftist or progressive to be against war. Most Americans are not leftists, but, look at how many people were against the Vietnam War eventually. It was the vast majority of Americans. They were sincere about it. They didn't like it. So, you gotta ask, why are virtually none of these armchair critics of these guys who protested AOC, why aren't they out there protesting her themselves? And, just what's happened to the anti-war movement that is more important to criticize the politics of critics of the U.S.'s involvement in Ukraine than it is to criticize U.S. involvement in Ukraine? Why isn't that our focus? Why is hardly anybody talking about the fact that the U.S. has been waging an economic war against not only Russia, but now with the, what seems to me, pretty evident U.S. responsibility for the sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipelines that go to Europe, rendering them, unable to get significant natural gas from Russia, which was by far Europe's main supplier before. So, the U.S. has sabotaged Europe's economy. It's attempted, unsuccessfully, so far, to sabotage Russia's economy. And it's insisted that European leaders go along with sanctions against Russian oil and gas. That, it turns out have only hurt them and not Russia. Why is hardly anyone talking about that? Why is hardly anyone on the left talking about this war? Where is the anti-war movement? All right. I will leave it at that and see you next time.